Big shout out to today's video sponsor, Linsoul. Check out their fantastic deals in the links in the video description. iPhones and Apple products in general hold on to their value fairly well, so it wouldn't surprise you really to find out that this 3.5-year-old flagship is still between £450 and £500 on the used market. Only joking, that's utterly surprising and actually quite shocking. So, is this thing really worth that kind of money, or should you go with something a bit more up to date? And if you own one, should you think about upgrading? That and more coming up in my review of the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Hey guys, I'm Ron Thomas and thanks to Vodafone for providing today's review unit. You can find links to their stores in the description. Let me start off with a hot take. I reckon the iPhones of this generation are the best feeling iPhones that we've ever had. The squared off corners just don't work on phones that are bigger than a mini, and I do feel like the frosted back, the glossy sides, and the way this thing feels in the hand, the balance, it's just the way it should be. Ergonomically, squared off edges don't work. And I'll die on that hill, I promise. Whilst we're on the topic, the 11 Pro Max hasn't aged much. I mean, sure, you can tell that it's a slightly older model due to those curved sides, but it doesn't look almost 4 years at all. The bezels are relatively thin. The notch, like back in 2018, hasn't really bothered me, so it doesn't bother me again in 2023. Although I have to say that the camera bump does look quite tiny, and it's quite hilarious actually, even compared to my iPhone 14 Pro non-Max. It just looks really tiny up in the corner there. But the phone does have a healthy weighting to it, great balance, crisp buttons and haptics. It all feels really good in 2023. It still has IP68 water and dust resistance, wireless charging, Apple CarPlay, Apple Pay, Face ID, hybrid stereo speakers, and the modern mod-cons that you expect from a modern iPhone. Sure, it lacks the 120Hz displays of the modern iPhones, but I mean, if you're not worried about that, and most people aren't, then you will absolutely enjoy the big 6.5-inch Quad HD OLED 60Hz display. It just looks and feels really good. Is it the best display on the market? No, and it wasn't even back then. That still went to the Samsung Plus or Ultra at the time. But I still think it looks really good, and I've enjoyed a lot of content on here. Whether we're talking YouTube or playing games, because it's a nice big screen and it's uninterrupted, you get a good experience from it. The main comparison I would make to the 14 Pro is actually just how much brighter the modern displays are. So the 11 Pro Max had a fairly bright display. I mean, it's still usable out and about in my review period with this, but compared to the 14 Pro, it just looks quite dim. The 14 Pro has a much brighter display. It gets way brighter outside, especially in high brightness mode, which is essentially where it uses the sensors to detect sunlight, and if it knows it's out in direct sunlight, it will boost the screen to an even further than 100% brightness just for a short period. The iPhone 11 Pro Max doesn't do nearly as well in that scenario, but it's still more than usable. I've been running iOS 16.2 on the iPhone 11 Pro Max. Unfortunately, you can't get the always on display, which is a shame now because they've updated the always on display and it looks way better than it used to, but it's still not available on here. You do get pretty much everything else though, and it looks like this phone will get another 2 years of software support, so I wouldn't worry about it, immediately running out of support, lifetime support, anywhere between now and 2025. I mean, heck, the iPhone 8 and iPhone 10 recently got iOS 16, so it's not the end of the world. With the iPhone 11 Pro being 2 generations later, you're not going to end up with those kinds of worries any earlier on than 2025. Performance also need not be a worry for you. The A13 Bionic and 4GB of RAM still perform admirably. I did experience some hiccups in higher end 3D titles like Genshin Impact, which is sort of my go-to benchmark. It's by no means a flawless experience, but you can get some gaming done on here, although that massively depends on whether your battery has degraded or not. See, the thing with the older smartphones, especially ones as old as 3.5 years old, is that you do tend to run into some battery degradation issues. Now, the battery that's in this review unit is pretty much perfect because it's a review unit, so it's not been hammered every day of its life, and that means that I'm able to get 1.5 days of usage absolutely fine. And I'm sure if I lowered my usage a bit more, I could probably get 2 days. It has fantastic standby battery life, meaning that when you're asleep you only drop a couple of percentage versus some Android phones that drop 15-20% overnight. So overall, my battery experience was really good, but I would not expect that from the majority of used smartphones out there, sitting around a battery health of 80% or lower, which is really not very good. And I imagine the majority of the iPhone 11 Pro Maxes out there on the used market are sitting between 60 and 70% battery health, which means you're probably just about going to get a full day of usage, maybe not even that. And getting the battery replaced on these is quite expensive. So that is somewhat a deal breaker. Although a bonus is that you do get the charger in the box, which is nice, I suppose. Now, the cameras on that tiny cluster, how do they perform 3 years later? Well, this phone is actually the generation before they introduced the big sensors on the Max model. So we're working with 3 relatively small 12 megapixel sensors on the back and a smaller still 12 megapixel selfie shooter as well. The hardware, at least on paper, has aged substantially. The 11 Pro Max's images look decidedly Apple-esque. There's lots of dynamic range, though I did find the HDR to not be as overdone with this gen compared to the newer models. It's probably just due to a lack of power. The colours err on the bright side, and it tends to automatically expose for the shadows, meaning that the skies do tend to get blown out even with HDR helping. Images look, if anything, quite natural really, thanks to the contrast, the white balance and the exposure capture of the 11 Pro Max being relatively accurate. There is a noticeable drop off in quality between the main and the ultra wide cameras. The 2x telephoto to a lesser degree, but it is still there. This is 1 or 2 generations before Apple really locked in its quality cohesion between the 3 sensors. This, after all, was the first gen of iPhone to have all 3 focal lengths on the back. And a side note, the 2x telephoto is around 25mm of full frame equivalent shorter than the iPhone 14 Pros, which is the 3x, meaning that you can't get quite nearly the same perspective or quality when you pinch in. In low light, nighttime environments, that kind of thing, night mode is really helping out, makes a huge difference between the standard and the night mode, more so than the 14 Pro. However, it's only available on the main sensor and not the ultra wide, which is a bit of a pain, and the overall low light image quality of more recent models really does trounce the 11 Pro Max here. It's a big step up. Selfies taken with the 11 Pro Max are okay, and I do think they look better with portrait mode on. It was done quite well here, but definitely not as refined as perfected as with the newer models. Though this has had quite a few camera updates, and I would say is probably better now than it was when it first came out. It still has that weird skin tone issue, which I'm going to go on about until Apple fixes it. It's been here since the iPhone 10, so yeah. Mentioning portrait mode there, computational photography modes are what I'd call good enough on the 11 Pro Max. They definitely do a job, but are using earlier hardware to do that job, and so the results are less refined and less consistent than on newer models. The cameras really are the reason to upgrade if you're so inclined. For most, the 11 Pro Max's cameras will be enough, and that, if anything, is a testament to just how well these older iPhones age and how good the cameras were when they first came out. Which kind of sums up the 11 Pro Max quite well. It was very over-engineered when it first came out, meaning that even today, almost 4 years later, it's still a really viable phone. It's quick, it's got a lovely screen, it's got decent cameras. The battery could use some work, but that's not necessarily a design issue, that's just the fact that batteries degrade over time. For £450 to £500 though, could I recommend going out and buying one? No, I don't think I could. If you could get it for around £350, maybe £300, then I would say that's worth a buy, but £500 for a 4-year-old flagship is just absurd. Go with something newer, even from Apple if you want. Just go with a Samsung or an Apple and get something that's high-end, a little bit more recent, and that's going to give you better battery performance. Massive thanks to Vodafone for providing today's review unit. This isn't a sponsored video by them, so they don't pay me to say nice things about their products, just to stick links in their video description, so do check those out. They've got some good deals on there, and also where you can find other iPhones on their store. Big thanks to Linsoul for sponsoring today's video. Links to everything will be in the video description as always. Please leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new around here to never miss a video like this one. I'm Ryan Thomas, and I'll see you later. Cheers.